So we're going on. Next speaker is going to be James Wright from the University of Calgary. Dr. Wright is a professor of pathology and laboratory medicine, professor of pediatrics, and the research scientist with the Julia McFarlane Diabetes Research Center at the University of Calgary. He's a recipient of the American Association for the History of Medicine William Oster Award, and he specializes in the history of pathology and the history of insulin. And he's going to speak to us on Glory Enough for All, Sad Aftermath of the Discovery of Insulin. James Wright.
So every young researcher dreams of making a great discovery, but few achieve it. If they do, success does not guarantee happiness. There's little satisfaction in discovering something if others get the credit, and those who achieve fame must face the winner's curse of living up to their reputation. Few discoveries have been more dramatic than the isolation of insulin, which, as Michael Bliss said, resembled a secular miracle. And yet, as he also pointed out, this great discovery brought little happiness to those who made it. Some were sidelined, and Banting and Best were saddled with the winner's curse. So here we look at the ways in which a great discovery can haunt its discoverers. So the discovery of insulin will be forever linked to the names of Banting and Best, but there was a distinct risk that Collip and Macleod might have been lastingly sidelined from the official narrative. This did not happen because a McGill physiology professor, James Cortus Bliss, alerted his brother Michael to the existence of some explosive files relating to the discovery. In 1982, Michael Bliss published The Discovery of Insulin, which showed previous investigators had been on the brink of discovering insulin and that Banting and Best could not have succeeded by their own unaided efforts. In 1984, he published Banting, a biography, which provided further vital details and cast more light on Banting's animosity towards Macleod. So now we're going to discuss the members of the team. So here we begin with E. Clark Noble, who was Charles Best's best friend. Here you can see them pictured together. So both graduated as joint silver medalists in physiology and biochemistry in June 1921, and were poised to begin one-year Master of Arts degrees under Macleod in the fall. Macleod hired them to assist Banting while splitting their vacation. They flipped a coin and Best went first. He proved an able assistant to Banting, and it was agreed he should continue for the rest of the vacation. Macleod asked Noble to study the effects of pancreatic extracts on blood glucose levels and hepatic glycogen when he came back from Scotland in September 1921, and he showed that hypoglycemia caused convulsions in rabbits, which could be reversed by glucose. Noble co-authored at least 10 early papers on insulin, 3 in 1922, 5 in 1923, and 1 each in 1924 and 25. In 1922, his master's thesis was entitled The Effects of a Pancreatic Extract on Experimental Diabetes. So Best's and Noble's friendship was stressed by diverging allegiances. Noble was proud to be associated with Macleod, but Banting, who unjustly believed that Macleod was trying to steal his glory, had maligned him so effectively that this did little to further Noble's career. Both graduated with honors from U of T Medical School in 1925, but the sequelae were different. Best's research training was supervised by Henry Hallett Dale, head of the Medical Research Council in the UK. Best had an impressive research career in Canada. Noble, increasingly embittered, became a general practitioner in Toronto. Best omitted Noble from the insulin story when Banting died and falsely claimed that the coin toss was invented by a reporter for the Toronto Star. Noble's contributions to insulin were never acknowledged. According to both of their sons, the friends had little contact after 1930. And for the 80th anniversary, I wrote a paper on Clark Noble, so you can read about it here. So next we'll discuss Charles Best and when best is not enough. So Macleod made insulin possible, Banting was pivotal. Collip adapted it for human use. Best alone made no unique contribution, for he simply applied the techniques his supervisor had both taught him and hired him to provide. Most evidence supports that he was there because of a coin toss. Still, he was a highly talented individual who made important contributions in later life, and his misfortune was to achieve glory at the age of 22. Bliss likened him to Tom Buchanan, the character in The Great Gatsby who had been a college football star. Everything else in life could only be anticlimax. So Best's long and successful research career was launched to a fanfare produced by his involvement in the discovery of insulin, but he became increasingly dissatisfied with this part of his legacy. He revealed in a meticulously researched but highly negative article by Bliss in 1993, Best began to rewrite history after Banting's death and boosted his own role in the discovery. Unconsciously or not, his recollections deviated from the facts. Bliss concluded that Best had a deep psychological hunger for recognition as a discoverer of insulin. The rancor persisted into the next generation as Best's younger son, Henry, a historian and president of Laurentian University, believed that revisionist history had shortchanged his father. In defiance of the norm that historians should avoid topics involving strong personal bias, Henry struggled to write the personal history of Charles Best, the co-discoverer of insulin. The tome, intended to be a rebuttal to Bliss's version of the story, took over a decade to write and was too long to publish until Henry cut it down to 500 pages shortly before his death. So now we'll move on to Frederick Banting and his peculiar character. So Frederick Banting had his great idea on the night of October 31st, 1921, while reading that obstruction of the pancreatic duct causes exocrine pancreas to atrophy, but does not necessarily cause diabetes. It occurred to him that ligating the duct could destroy the digestive juices while leaving the anti-diabetic factor intact. The idea was not original, and it was also wrong. Student physiology textbooks clearly stated that the proteolytic enzyme trypsin isn't inactive until it reaches the intestine. Banting spent 4 tiresome months trying to work his way around a non-existent problem. Banting apparently never appreciated that his great idea was irrelevant to the discovery of insulin. He took his idea to J.J.R. Macleod, who was at the summit of his profession and also very Scottish, reserved and academic to the core. Banting was a raw farmer's boy who would likely be said to have dyslexia today. He was a dogged rather than outstanding student. His manners were awkward and taciturn. He was a well-meaning and honest man, but he had limited insight into other people's motives or indeed his own. His awkwardness was counterbalanced by stubborn determination. While what Macleod privately called his peculiar character dominated subsequent events. So Macleod must have seen at a glance that Banting was monumentally ill-equipped to take on such a project. Even so, he went out of his way to help. Sentiment may have played a part because Banting was a war hero and Macleod's brother had also won a military cross for medical work under fire before dying of tuberculosis in 1919. Macleod was an experienced supervisor and apparently tried to instill a note of cautious realism into the discussion, but Banting merely resented it. It was not a good omen. Banting's work, began his work in June 1921, and he and Best generated evidence for the existence of what they called islin over the next 6 years. Their success was made possible by recent advances in biochemical testing made elsewhere. And if you're interested in more details, I've written a paper on that. Best had been trained by Macleod to perform state-of-the-art blood glucose and other biochemical tests. Neither Banting nor Best had the experience to purify and extract for human use. This became manifest when their preparation failed to help Leonard Thompson on January 11, 1922. Banting's role effectively ended with the first successful human injection. His surgical skills were now redundant. Different expertises were needed to scale up the production of insulin and introduce it into clinical practice. His sense of vulnerability was heightened by a growing conviction that Macleod and Collip were conspiring to steal his glory. He physically assaulted Collip on at least one occasion. He threatened to throw Macleod out of a window on another. By his own admission, he abandoned the work for the month of March 1922, sulked in his room, and resorted to drinking lab alcohol. When Best finally persuaded him to merge, he did so to discover that he was well on his way to becoming a national hero. Despite his virtually unchallenged rise to fame, his hatred for Macleod became ever more virulent. This appears to have taken Macleod by surprise, and all efforts at mediation were unsuccessful. The situation went from bad to worse until Macleod's only practical option was either to submit or to sue Banting for defamation. He submitted, and to an extent that seems almost abject. His own publications were not to imply that he played any role in the discovery, and Banting and Best were named on papers to which they made little or no contribution. The mounting tension came to a head with the joint award of a Nobel Prize. Banting was so incandescent at Macleod's inclusion that he had to be talked out of refusing the award. He accepted the award but refused to share the platform with Macleod. So Banting destroyed Macleod's career, and to read about this, these are really the two best sources as shown here. So Macleod was a genteel, small, middle-aged scholar, a world's expert on carbohydrate metabolism. He was shy, non-confrontational, and dignified. To Banting, he appeared arrogant, elitist, and aloof. Banting was at his best when he did not feel challenged, and some of the children that he treated have happy memories of him. And these are 3 books where you can read about that. Recently, following the edition of the personal papers of Billy Ross, a well-connected Toronto physician who was Banting's friend and confidant, to the U of T Fisher Archives, it became apparent that Banting had suicidal tendencies in the early months of 1922. In fact, some have now speculated that his paranoia, combativeness, excessive alcohol consumption, and depression are evidence of post-traumatic stress disorder as a sequela of his heroic service as a surgeon on the Western Front. Fortunately, Banting found some consolation in outdoor activities and tried his hand at painting, for which he showed some aptitude, and poetry, for which he did not. He was cursed by his habit of falling out with colleagues, and yet, despite the blemishes, we're left with the impression of a decent, dogged man who threw himself unstintingly into everything that he did. His misfortune that he was woefully ill-equipped to live up to the expectations that he had fostered. But he worked resolutely within the research institute gifted to him by a grateful country, unsuccessfully setting his sights on cancer and adrenal steroids. A colleague said in 1924, and I quote, "So much adulation has had a bad effect on Banting and has made him very unhappy," end quote. Another colleague noted that he, quote, "is now obsessed with the idea of doing something big by himself so that no honor will go to Macleod," end quote. So it's ironic that Banting, who desperately wanted the glory for the discovery, hated the adoration and public responsibilities that came with being worshipped as a hero. It did not help that journalists haunted his trail and boosted every half-baked statement into eye-catching headlines. One announced that Banting was seeking, quote, "a cure for metabolism," end quote. Banting enlisted at the beginning of World War II and served as a Canadian research liaison with the UK. He died in an airplane crash in Newfoundland, attempting to fly the North Atlantic in February 1941. Strangely, the mystery of Banting's death was later turned into historical spy fiction with Banting being assassinated while developing biological weapons to be used against Germany. So now we move to Macleod. So Banting and Macleod became increasingly alienated. Macleod was a modest, retiring person, and he was unaccustomed to dealing with such a highly disruptive colleague. Macleod simply bowed to Banting's demands and got on with the task at hand, which was to support the work on physiological actions of insulin and to liaise with the companies involved in its commercial development. He played a key role in Toronto's Insulin Committee, which ensured that insulin would be freely licensed throughout the world while preventing any commercial entity from securing a monopoly. He was a member of the Standardization Committee established by the League of Nations to define the international unit and to establish standards for manufacture. Unobtrusively, Macleod did much to launch insulin on the world. Macleod left U of T in 1928 when appointed Regius Professor of Physiology at his alma mater, the University of Aberdeen. Banting's hatred was so extreme that he refused to attend Macleod's U of T farewell banquet prior to his return to Scotland, but asked that a place be set for him in order to remain conspicuously empty. Already crippled by arthritis, Macleod pointedly shuffled his feet as he boarded the train to, quote, wipe away the dirt of the city, end quote. Macleod maintained a lasting and dignified silence about events in Toronto, and Macleod and Best were left in undisputed possession of the field for the next 50 years. U of T was complicit in maligning Macleod as it had documentation that could have helped set the record straight, but kept it confidential, apparently at Best's request. Historians failed to understand his experiments with fish insulin in 1922 to 24 and depicted these as a futile displacement activity. Fish insulin was a brave attempt to solve a real problem, for the yield of insulin from bovine pancreas was so poor in the first part of 1922 as to suggest that there would never be enough to meet clinical demand. The introduction of isoelectric focusing solved the problem, but this lay in the future when Macleod, Clark Noble, and graduate student Norman McCormick set out to find an alternative source. Despite the challenges of harvesting islets while trawlers battled the high seas, Noble and McCormick developed a cheap means of producing insulin. Fish insulin was successfully used to treat unknowing patients in the Toronto General Hospital, but all of this went into the dustbin of history when the problem of beef insulin was solved. So, nevertheless, Macleod's fish insulin research contributed to his selection as co-recipient of the 1923 Nobel Prize, as it was considered to be the definitive proof that the islets and not the exocrine pancreas were the source of insulin. All of this was possible because of Macleod's encyclopedic knowledge included the fact that bony fish were known to have anatomical separation of their endocrine and exocrine pancreata. And so I wrote a paper on this for the 80th anniversary. So James Bertram Collip played a small but essential role. The U of A biochemistry professor was there on sabbatical. He joined the insulin team, as we've heard, on December 12, 1921. He quickly made an improved extract. It lowered blood glucose in normal rabbits, and there was no longer a need to test potency in diabetic dogs. His extract was successfully used to treat Leonard Thompson on January 23, 1922. He was in the right place at the right time with the right skill set, and his focus seems to have been on the work rather than the reward. He was the only member of the quintet to have been unscarred by the discovery of insulin. He left Toronto in April 1922. According to Bliss, Collip, quote, always maintained that the truth about the discovery of insulin was to be found in the scientific publications of those years, and perhaps someone would be able to piece it all together after they had all died, end quote. In the last interview that Banting ever gave on the discovery, he credited Collip's contributions to the research as being more important than those of Best. Collip and Banting became friends, and he had met Banting just before the fatal flight to give him a pair of sheepskin gloves. So Glory Enough for All was released as a made-for-television movie by the CBC in 1988. It won 9 Gemini Awards, and it was based on Michael Bliss's books, and he served as its consultant. So the bitter rivalry between the group was somewhat pitiful, for there really was glory enough for all. The 4 discoverers were never photographed together. Below is the only photograph of even 3. In conclusion, the story unearthed by Michael Bliss is strangely compelling. 4 men stumbled unwittingly into the pantheon of fame. Banting's personality was vital to his success, but became a major handicap afterwards. Best's role as a student assistant trained in laboratory techniques was equally necessary, but Noble might have performed just as well. Collip rescued the whole venture, and Macleod's quiet stewardship made it possible. There truly was glory enough for all. The lives of millions of people have been transformed, yet success did not bring personal happiness. Those of us who are not destined for glory might reflect that it sometimes is better to travel hopefully than to arrive. And I would also like to acknowledge my collaborator on this paper, the esteemed diabetologist Edwin Gale. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wright. So we've had a great, compelling set of stories. Thank you. And what I'd like to do is have a little period of questioning. I'm sure there are many questions. This is all unraveled like a suspenseful Netflix series.
What I'm obliged to say is that I have a slightly different slant on the coin toss story. I'm now in my late 80s. In the early 50s, I had the privilege of working in Dr. Best's lab. First, when I was in the high schools, and at that point my job was to look after the laboratory animals. And secondly, when I was a medical student. I remember my interview before I could be accepted with Dr. Best, and the only memory I have is that he had an extremely large desk, and he didn't question my purpose of going into medicine. The second lab that I worked in that belonged to him was after the Best Institute had been built. And there was a scientist there whose name, if I remember correctly, was Rosemary Hawkins. And she told me that Best lost the coin toss and was very disappointed that he had to work with Dr. Banting. Dr. Noble won. Whether that's true, but I remember that story very clearly.
Thank you. James?
Yeah, Robert T. Noble basically said the same thing. And so, I mean, there's the controversy that exists as to whether the coin toss ever happened. Best said both. He late in his career indicated that there was no coin toss and that it was made up by the press. On the other hand, much to the point you're making, he once told Fred Banting, "Who said I won the coin toss?" And so it may very well be that, as you're suggesting, as Robert T. Noble, who was Clark Noble's younger brother, and became very famous in cancer research, and there's a medal named after him. It may very well be that Best lost the coin toss, and that's how he ended up working, with Banting. And it's also kind of not entirely clear there's nothing that I can find where Clark Noble writes and says, I lost the coin toss. He always is very cagey about there was a coin toss and it was determined that Best would go first. So you may very well be exactly right.
Please come to the mic.
It's also how you would interpret winning or losing it at the time. Because this was a summer job, and Best and Noble were very close, and they would enjoy summer off anyway. And so whether they would interpret as winning or losing at the time, before anything happened, makes a big difference in how you actually understand winning or losing it. Looking in hindsight from later, sure, Best makes perfect sense to think he won the toss because he got the glory and got to do the job, and Noble would have said the other opposite. So anyway, that's part of the debate.
Both also had fiancés
exactly.
who were, I think, very interested in having a little more time,
exactly.
with their partners. So, that would be another way to look at it.
Exactly, yeah.
I think as we've been hearing for all morning and 100 years before, all coins have at least two sides. And in this story, they always had an edge as well.
Wonderful talks, all. Thank you so much. We've heard twice now the quote from Colic about the publications telling the story. So I would question some of the very early publications that were generated during that process of discovery, in which Macleod did not actually include his name, and whether or not that perhaps contributed to the lessening or the diminution of his contributions over time.
Macleod was very, very sensitive to appearances, and because of the conflict with Banting, he kind of bent over backwards to make sure his name was not on papers unless they were purely physiological in nature, or he had to have his name on the paper in order to be able for the paper to be presented, such as the presentation that we're celebrating exactly 100 years ago today. So I think you're absolutely right.
Further questions?
Yes, John, if I may. Dr. Wright, I'm intrigued with your notion that Sir Frederick Banting might have had evidence of PTSD. Now, this was a suggestion, I think, dropped by Jesse Roth and John Dirks in their paper. I think that's a very interesting notion, but I think it needs to be substantiated as opposed to repeated without a real careful analysis by qualified psychiatric analysis.